Hi everyone, so Twisting Blades has just received a massive buff and a lot of people have been waiting for a more viable melee playstyle, and Twisting Blades is back. Now it's not like the top build in the game or something like that, but we believe it's going to perform pretty fine. We actually moved it up from C to A tier now, and there is definitely potential for a pretty good melee rogue setup. So first things first, we have some buffs here in the mid-season patch that's going live very soon. So we have just like a straight up 20% damage buff to the Twisting Blades itself. They've also buffed, for example, other effects that go into typical Twisting Blades builds, like the versatility glyph for the poison imbuement. So that was pretty nice. Fluidity glyph now is buffed, so you can use that as well. And there's some other little things, and also the Blade Dancer aspect here. So that is also stronger. So all in all, this build has received a pure damage buff of like 50-60% or something like that, depending on the exact version. And it's going to be much better than before. Now, there are better builds on the Rogue, and there's certainly better builds on other classes, but A tier is pretty solid if you really like Twisting Blades. On top of this, I have gone back and actually theory crafted more on the setup to try to really min-max everything we can. And I found something pretty interesting here. So what you can see here right now is me getting multiple combo points at once. In fact, 3 combo points from a single puncture. So this is a mechanic that I explored a little bit more now that Twisting Blades is back on the menu. And it turns out we can really use this to our advantage in this setup, because compared to, for example, precision builds, we do not need to do multiple attacks in order to stack precision, where we cannot really benefit from multiple combo points from a single attack. However, this is not the case for Twisting Blades. Instead, getting more combo points just gives you more damage, and you can get to the point where you can play a one-to-one cycle between Puncture and Twisting Blades. And in fact, on top of this, there is a change in this patch that allows you to actually play a pure melee playstyle with Inner Sight as well. So I have a version of that as well that I made, which is actually fairly similar to the combo points version, so you can kind of easily swap between them. But you can actually change the playstyle to like a full melee, just spam Twisting Blades variant, basically. So with that being said, I went ahead and updated the existing max roll Twisting Blades guide. So I went through this for like a few hours, testing those mechanics and trying to find exactly those breakpoints that are important here in order to make this really work well. Also figure out what is going on with those combo points. So I have a full planner here that has the endgame progression all the way starting from level 50, leveling to 100, endgame and pit version. There's also a version for speed farming and bossing if you like to do that. And then we have the Uber variants as well. So there's this one here is like the standard variant with combo points, and the Inner Sight version as well. So this kind of unlocks once you get the starter skies and potentially the Harlequin crest. So before that, I would not really recommend to go Inner Sight, but it seems like this could be at least competitive, potentially even stronger than a combo point build, despite the fact that you can get multiple combo points in one go with this. So there is definitely a bit of potential for this. I will try both and you'll see what happens. But at the very least, it should be close to the point where you can play an Inner Sight Poison Twisting Blades build now, which should perform pretty well. Now, the mechanic that I mentioned at the start with the multiple combo points is based on resource generation, more specifically puncture resource generation. So this is a temper that exists on the resource tempers that you can put on your rings and your amulet. And funny enough, this actually gives you extra combo points. So that was already known from the PTR, but it was not really useful for any rogue build up until now. So I actually had this already in the planner, but now I really went back and min-maxed this like completely to see like, you know, what we can do with this. And the thing is that there is another source of resource generation that also comes into play here, which is the resource generation granted by strength. So at least for rogues, strength gives you resource generation. And for example, in this setup here, we have 14.3% extra resource generation. So what happened in the past when I was unaware of this mechanic is that sometimes you would just get a second combo point. Like anyone might have noticed this at some point playing a rogue with a combo point build. Sometimes you just get 2 combo points for no reason. And this is the reason. So what happens is that you attack, you get 1 combo point, and then every, for example, 6-7 attacks or so with this value, you will get 2 combo points because you get decimal, like 0.14 combo points basically. And then every 8 attacks, it goes to 2 and so on. And now those 2 values actually multiply. And this leads us to the point where we can actually get 3 combo points in one single shot. So for example, if you look at those planar values here, we have 14.3%. And then we have, for example, the 165.5% bonus. And if you multiply those values, you get to 3.03, for example. So in this version here, with this amount of puncture resource generation, you can get 3 common points for a single puncture, which is pretty powerful. Now, it is kind of tough to get there because you need to have a pretty high roll of this puncture resource generation. And then you also need to masterwork it up at least twice the way it seems if you want to get this exact 3 common points per puncture. But it's not too bad, and you can definitely get away with, for example, a lower roll, or you don't hit the masterwork, because then you're just going to get 2 common points, do your twisting blades, then you get 2 common points again, do your twisting blades, then you get 3 common points, do your twisting blades. It's not the end of the world missing that 1 common point here and there. So you can still play this 1-to-1 cycle, or potentially even do like, 2-to-1 sometimes, just to make sure that you have those 3 common points. But for the most part, you can still play 1-to-1, and it will be just fine until you get better gear and you maybe masterwork this up a little bit. So the more the merrier, because you can get to those 3 common points faster. And once you get to this breakpoint, you will get exactly 3 common points per cast of puncture, which is really good. Now, the main problem that comes with playing such a setup is that you actually do a lot of twisting blades and consume your poison imbuement very quickly. This is also why you want to have extra poison imbuement casts on your other ring. And then, at least for the final version, you have a Starless Skies. And Starless Skies is really powerful, so you kind of don't want to miss out on that, at least once you have access to those Uber Uniques. Before that, it is a bit easier because you can just have 2 rings with, for example, this Poison Imbuement Temper. But at least in late game version, well, you need to have a lot of Poison Imbuement casts on one single item, because one is occupied by a unique, the other one is occupied by the puncture thing. So you only have this. And in order to actually make use of Poison Imbuement on every single hit, you also have to go for Bursting Venoms. So this is what we used to play in the past. When I originally made my guide for the season start for Twisting Blades, I did not go for Bursting Venoms because it was quite possible to just have permanent Poison Imbuement basically by having those extra casts. And you didn't even need to rely on any lucky hit or any Bursting Venoms or anything like that. Bursting Venoms being the ability to reset the cooldown and get infinite Poison Imbuement activations basically. So you have to go for this, and you have to have like one pretty juicy ring here or an amulet with the Poison Imbuement extra casts. So you want to try to get to at least double masterwork, maybe a triple, and then this will feel really good, and you're going to get consistent Bursting Venom procs, giving you infinite poisons basically. So the more you have here, the higher the chances are that you get this infinity activation basically. So this also means that if you have like a pretty low gear level, or you don't really masterwork the right stuff on especially your jewelry, then you will either not get all these combo points. So again, you can do like, 1-to-1 cycle, but you will get 2 common points instead of 3, not the end of the world. But for example, the Poison Imbuement cast, it can happen if you don't really have this temper, you have only like 2 charges or maybe 4 or 5 or so. Well, it will feel somewhat inconsistent to try to trigger those Bursting Venom pools, because they can only happen when you attack with your Poison Imbuement. So this means that the more casts you have, the more likely it is to get the infinite kind of critical mass breakpoint, so to say, where you always get the poison pools all the time. But the solution is that you just don't run Starless Skies, and instead you are gonna have like a second ring with the Poison Imbuement cast. It's much easier to get this going because you can have more of those Poison Imbuement casts much more easily. You don't have to like Omega Masterwork them, and it's much easier. However, you're gonna do less damage, and you're gonna have more issues with your resources. So you'll have to put like a resource roll, for example, on your 2-handed weapon in order to make this setup work without Starless Skies. So this is where you start basically, and then later you can transition with the Starless Skies to removing this resource cost here. And then once you have the ring like this, you're gonna be fine with those Poison Imbuement casts. But you want to probably get to like at least 7, probably 8 plus Poison Imbuement casts. And then you're gonna have, a bunch of lucky hit, a bunch of, extra attack speed and so on. And this is how the setup will function later. Now there's one other note here, which is Harlequin Crest. It also has resource generation. And I talked about the puncture resource generation earlier. It turns out that normal resource generation does not actually work for this combo point effect. So this is exclusively tied to strength and maybe basic resource generation from, for example, Necromancer Tempers, if you want to do that. But this is just weaker than the puncture resource generation. But it needs to be puncture resource generation and strength. And those two numbers together need to give you enough to get those 3 combo points at once. So if you have, for example, Harlequin Crest, which is a very strong item here, well, you want to use that, but the resource generation cannot be included in that calculation and doesn't help you out with this temper and in order to get those free call points per cast. While we're on the topic of the helm, a lot of people also ask me, do you want to use Andariel's Visage on this? And I would say rather not. You can do that if you have it. It might even be better than a normal helm. And maybe it would even be better than a Harlequin because Andariel's is getting a pretty sick buff. But to be real, Andariel's has its own build. And if you want to really play an Andariel's build, you should play that Andariel's build, which means the Andariel Puncture Rogue here and not Twisting Blades. So if you want to play Twisting Blades, you can stick an Andariel's in there and it will probably be pretty decent, but it doesn't really go for all that crazy lucky hit that the Andariel's Rogue does. So it will just be like a weak form of Andariel's Rogue basically, but you also have a Twisting Blades, so that might come out on top. But either way, Harlequin Crest is the way, I would say, for this setup. Now let's talk about the rest of this build a little bit. So there were some changes here in case you have played Twisting Blades before in the season. Most notably, I have focused this a lot more on the Caltrops damage as well. So we have triple Caltrops duration tempers now. So this allows you to get like a 30-second or more Caltrops, which means that this damage buff stacks to ridiculous amounts. You can see this here right now on the modifiers. 164% extra damage, for example, and this is not even fully masterwork. There's only one master crit here, there's 3 here, 2 there, so you can go even crazier. I can get like, I don't know, up to almost 40 seconds or so Caltrops if you really want, and this gives you a pretty big buff. So why do you want this? Well, it's because the weakness of rogues, in particular of close quarter combat rogues, which, well, Twisting Blades is one of those builds, is the boss. So you want to walk up to the boss, you want to put down that Caltrops, and you want to keep the boss in there, especially during those staggered phases where you do like 10 times the amount of damage compared to not staggered phases. So this is how you take down bosses. We go all in on a Caltrops duration because there's no other real temper anyway for the weapon slot. Twisting Blades temper is useless. And then there's the puncture temper, but it also doesn't really do much, especially if you don't puncture that much anyway, with all this extra puncture resource generation. So we just go for the Caltrops, and there you go. So you have a pretty back multiplier, and this is where I want to use it. You can also use the Caltrops here and there, like for example the pit, and throw it on elite pack, but for the most part you will really only care about it on the boss, so this is why it's there. And the rest of the setup, I have reworked this slightly. So previously you had like a smoke grenade here, which is nice, but I feel like it's not really needed anymore. These days you can just go for dash and shadow step, so you have an unstoppable there, which is nice, and you're just mobile, which is great, and then you have the puncture and twisting blade. So that's like how the skill tree looks. There's a few other, like, passives and so on that we have here that just help out. A lot of people are always confused about why is Dark Shroud in a build. Well, first of all, Dark Shroud goes into every single rogue build, like ever, when it comes to the pit, and we have it activated through the Amber's aspect here. So in mid-season update, this is actually getting changed to now work with all of your skills, as long as they crit and not just marksman skills. This is also part of the reason why an inner sight Twisting Blades build is actually feasible now, because it works with your melee skills, previously only your range skills. So this is very nice. We have this here. This gives you the Dark Shrouds. You don't generate them that quickly, but as long as you're careful and you CC enemies quite a lot in the setup as well, you should be fine, and you should not lose them that much, and especially on the pit bosses where you get a lot of big hits and kind of like a low frequency of those. This is a very good defensive option here, so you want to invest into that. Now let's talk about the poison imbuement here a little bit. So poison imbuement is where all of your damage comes from. If you don't attack with poison imbuement, it will do 0 damage. This is heavily invested into poisons. We have glyphs, we have the investment here on the skill tree. You also go for a lot of crit chance to boost this blended poison imbuement here, for example. So every time you crit, you get a 75% boost, which is massive as well. So we have a lot of crit for this. And it also helps out with like some other things like Umbrus. It helps out with siphoning strikes and so on. There's a few other things where you want to crit enemies as much as possible. So you go for, yeah, as much as you can, basically. In fact, with Inner Sight, it is possible to cap out at 100% crit chance. So that's kind of cool, I guess. And every single hit will be like a yellow number, and you're going to get these effects, and it's going to be pretty awesome. You also have a bunch of like other like defensive options here. So every time you apply your poisons, you also get, for example, 15% damage reduction. So this is kind of cool here. And we also have a lot of lucky hit here. So whenever we attack with poisoned attacks, we have extra lucky hit, helping us out with all of our tempers. So for example, here's a freeze temper to activate our frigid finesse. There's another freeze temper. Here's an immobilize. Here's a stun. So that is all like just helpful to stagger bosses, to crowd control enemies, keep you safe. And for example, we also have here the rapid gambits and trick attacks. So when you critically strike a dazed enemy, they are knocked down. So you can also knock them down with the daze from the Twisting Blades itself. And this can activate, for example, the Retribution Ring. Let's talk about resource management a little bit. This is a relatively resource-hungry setup, at least in the late game, when you actually have this puncture resource generation, which ironically makes it harder to sustain your resources and not easier. Because puncture resource generation, well, it actually applies to this node here, which gives you slightly more energy when you hit a crowd-controlled enemy. However, what you care about is boss damage, and bosses cannot be crowd-controlled outside of stagger. So during the stagger, you get this effect. Outside of stagger, you get nothing. So this means you have to solve resources another way, and this resource generation thing does not actually help you to really solve that issue. So otherwise, we have to go for example, energy per second. We have this here on the chest. You can also put this on another slot like the boots as well, or even at the start, you can put it on the helm. So we might have this here. You can kind of like experiment a little bit. Maybe your resources don't feel that fine early on. Put a second roll of energy per second. This will help you greatly. Or resource cost reduction on the weapon. This also helps out quite a lot until later on you get the starter skies, as I mentioned. So there's a bit of a progression here. You want to try to make sure that you don't run out of resources. That's kind of important. Another way to do this as well is innovation. So here in the earlier versions, we actually go for 3 points, for example, and later on we can free that up a little bit because starter skies kind of just takes care of it. And then you have, for example, Alchemist's Fortune. So it makes it easier to get your lucky hits and, you know, sustain the bursting venoms, for example, and so on. Another note about the gear is that you want a lot of damage to crowd-controlled enemies. The reason for that is that we have the close quarter combat passive here that scales with damage to crowd-controlled enemies. So this is like one of your biggest multipliers in the entire setup outside of the caltrops. So you want to make sure you stack this up as much as possible. So everywhere you can temper on offensive slots, you're going to put damage to crowd-controlled enemies. This is kind of important here, outside of, like, for example, the caltrops temper and then those resource tempers I explained earlier. And well, everything else is just kind of like you try to fix your res. So early on, you need like probably 2, maybe 3 items with resistances. And later on, actually with starter skies, you can solve it with a single item, which is kind of cool. You have, like, for example, a pants with some all res. You don't need to like up it or something like that with masterworking. And the starter skies has lots of all res. And then it's kind of easy to solve that res issue at least. You can go, for example, more dodge chance, more life, or more whatever. And you have like a pretty good mix of stats here. One last thing to talk about here for the gear is also that there is the stat called % damage and damage over time. So there's 2 different options here. For example, on your crossbow, you can put that, or on your other weapons. They are effectively equal. For damage over time effects, % damage applies 2 times, and it has exactly half the value on your items. So they are basically equal. Technically, % damage is slightly better because you also do non-dot damage, but it's somewhat negligible. So if you get a good item that has damage over time or % damage, it doesn't really matter. And you also generally want to go for the daggers here and not for the swords. A lot of people ask me about that. They have the same DPS, but daggers are a little bit faster, and they have an implicit that actually does more than nothing, because the swords have crit damage, which does not work with poison imbuement. Now, when it comes to the final setups that you're actually working towards with the Harlequin and the starter skies, you have the option to either play inner sight or call points, as I explained earlier. And they're actually very similar. They have almost exactly the same skill tree, they have almost exactly the same aspect, they have the same paragons. It's kind of interesting how close those setups actually are. So the main difference really is that you just cast basically no punctures or almost no generator casts at all. And you spam a lot more Twisting Blades when you play this with inner sight. So you need to reach this certain like kind of breakpoint of your resources where you can just spam it for 4 to 5 seconds before you run out of resources, and then inner sight activates and then it fills it up. It gives you 0 resource cost. And don't worry, even with inner sight active, you can actually keep up starter skies. For some reason, the stacks refresh even with 0 cost for your Twisting Blades, and then rinse and repeat basically. So that's kind of cool. There is a bit of a difference though, which is that we have Heartseeker instead of Puncture, and we also run the Accursed Touch aspect. So this is something that I don't have in the original build, but we have it in the inner sight build because we need to apply vulnerables somehow, especially for the corruption aspect here. This is a very powerful boost, and if you don't make enemies vulnerable, then, well, you're going to lose out on that. And this means also when you don't play with inner sight and you play the typical combo point build, you kind of want to spread your vulnerable with your puncture to the priority targets. You want to try to hit, for example, the elites in the pack, you know, one attack on this guy, one attack on this guy, one attack on this guy, and kind of like, you know, cycle through them. If you don't like this at all, you can also put a Cursed Touch on this build instead of Inner Calm, for example, but ultimately you care about the boss damage the most, so I replaced a Cursed Touch there on the combo point versions where puncture can apply vulnerable. But it's very short, it's only 2 seconds and only on one target, so this means that yeah, you have to kind of like work a little bit for it. It's easier to do when you play the inner sight version because you just hit enemies and then a Cursed Touch procs, and this makes everything vulnerable all the time, triggering the extra damage and the corruption aspect. There's also one other interesting change here. This is that we have Heartseeker in this build. So why Heartseeker? Well, we get 15% crit chance, especially good for single targets, because you can ramp this up with 3 hits, and we also get 16% attack speed, which is kind of nice. Since you want to solve your resources another way anyway, and not really around this puncture thing here, we can just go for Heartseeker instead. And on top of this, I actually put Heartseeker duration on the weapon. We can also put this on like a one-handed weapon if you want. If you, for example, want to master this up a little bit. And the idea is that you just do like one Heartseeker cast every 7 seconds. This keeps up your might buff. You have to do it every 8 seconds anyway for the close quarters buff. So roughly around that time. And like this, you can keep up these buffs much more easily with the Heartseeker duration. 15 crit is no joke. I explained blended poison immune, for example, and 16% attack speed is really helpful too. So instead of puncture, we go for this, and then we remove one of the Caltrops tempers and we go for that. And another change on this gear is also that instead of this puncture resource generation that I talked about earlier at the start, well, obviously we don't have call points, we don't need that stuff anymore, we don't even run puncture. So in this case, you can actually go for the double poison imbuement extra casts, and this makes it much easier to actually just not run out of charges and keep your bursting venoms pools up. And whenever these things trigger, then you reset your cooldown while standing in the pool. It's gonna flash on your bar, so there's like a you know, flashing icon on your poison imbuement, and this is the time to just press it again, because this will make sure that you reset to full charges and you have a cooldown ready right after that, so you can just keep going with poison imbuement. And with a bunch of lucky hit and a bunch of these extra poison imbuement casts, you can actually get to the point where with inner sight up, you can permanently spam your poison twisting blades. So that feels pretty good. So this is what our build looks like. I will try it out as soon as the patch goes live, basically. So either on Monday or on Tuesday, I'll be playing some twisting blades. I also have some other stuff planned, like the pulverized druid and the Andariel Sork. So let's see how this will go. And I also want to benchmark with the Andariel Puncture Rogue a little bit, because it's like a very powerful build. So you kind of see where the high end lies basically and how Twisting Blades compares to this. But I'm definitely excited to jump in and try some Twisting Blades again. I think a lot of people are looking forward to that. So here is my setup. Now there is also like the starter and the level 50 version, these kind of things here. So I didn't really go into this now. It's very similar to the endgame stuff anyway, so you kind of build the same Paragon boards. You might go for a little bit of Shadow Imbuement maybe early on as well. It's kind of nice while leveling, for example, and later on it just doesn't need to do damage anymore in the pit, so you just kind of drop that at some point. And then you go for like no Shadow Imbuement, you have an extra dash instead, and these kind of things. You can also read up on all of that in the progression sections here in the Twisting Blades guide. So here, this is all explained. We have like, you know, the starter version, and you see like the progression, what you have to do, how you change the skill tree, and then the leveling. Then we have the pit version, speed farming for like Hell Tides, for example, bossing for the tormented bosses. And here I'm actually going to add the inner sight version as well as a separate variant with a few explanations that I just put into this video. So this is what you can expect here. And I'm definitely looking forward to some Twisting Blades action. Hope you are too. Hope you enjoyed this guide. So I'll have more to share once I actually get to play it with the new version and the, you know, improved setup basically that we've been cooking for a while. I've spent like several hours trying to min-max that Paragon, min-max the exact, you know, stats on every single piece basically. And let's see what comes out of it. So hope you liked this, and I'll see you guys next time.